maybe I look at these policies, maybe I think about how true they are, maybe I question the fundamental values of the people involved and work out what their motivations are, we think, even if this is just a tiny change, we think it's quite a significant one, but even if it's just a tiny change to the ability for you to make decisions, you make so many decisions every single day, that is a massive impact. Some of these are really important, like voting in an election. Some of them, not so important. Every single day the decision is approved, that is a massive impact within the scope of this debate. I'll take a POI now.
Don't you think it's important that the students engage with the author's perspective of the text?
No. Right, moving to our second point on understanding other people's perspectives. Firstly, and I think I've talked somewhat about this already, but I'll go into more detail. Firstly, you just have to engage with and understand other people's different points of view and different ways of seeing text. You have to talk to them about it. You have to do this in an analytical way to actually try and understand it. Secondly, and I think this is really important to note, is that you're not just seeing other people's point of views, you're seeing it in a space where they have to justify that point of view. We think that's actually quite rare today, where someone gives a point of view and you don't just go, oh yeah, that's what they think. They actually have to give you reasons why, giving the source material, why is this what they're interpreting based on their values, based on their life experiences. We think this provides an incredible scope for you to learn to engage with people in a useful way, where you're actually able to work from the same basis to go, what is driving you? Can I explain to you why I think this thing is wrong, or is this actually just a fundamental disagreement that we're always going to disagree about? We think that's very useful, right? Fourthly, and touched on this before, but we think that you take things away from this understanding that relate far more to your own life, right? We think it's actually quite useful for you to be able to look at a text and go, actually, with my experience, I think, that looking at my life, maybe it's more useful for me to look at this text about the suffering of some minority group 100 years ago in this country that no longer applies, and see a link to the suffering of groups within my own country that actually matters to me. We think that is very useful because that feeds into your decision making, feeds into your understanding of the world, feeds into the way you vote. Right, outcomes real quickly. I think this is very similar to the first point. It's again just understanding others, being able to engage with them, being able to discuss with them better, being able to make better decisions, to see other people's perspectives, to come to agreements and isolate what are your disagreements, what are your how are you able to come to a conclusion cooperation. Right, quickly, I'm going to do some weighing across both of the outcomes of both of these points, right? As I told you, we think ultimately the scope of this debate probably isn't that large because it's about how we interpret literature. This isn't going to be world-ending outcomes. We think within the scope of this debate, we have really, really large outcomes when we are able to, significantly affect every single decision someone is making on a daily basis. Their understanding of every single text that they read is a whole lot better. Their understanding of the world is a whole lot better. We think we can win on this. Thank you.
Thank the speaker for this speech. Now that we've got the live stream running, I'll just double check that everyone's happy to consent to being filmed today. Fabulous. Okay, I will invite the first negating speaker up to the stand.
In this debate today, we're going to prove to you that exclusively on our side of the house, people get a deeper and more realistic analysis of literature. I'm going to begin with my first point. How death of the author discourages people from understanding alternate perspectives, and my second point on how limitations on social commentary and knowledge gained, and my second speaker will talk about our split, the implication for political understanding. To start off with, I'm going to do a little bit of rebuttal. First of all, the affirmative team have told us that this means people can have a bit more of a debate about whose perspective, people's perspective versus each other. I mean, the first thing is they've actually set this whole debate in a high school English classroom, which we think is really minimizing the impacts of death of the author. And we see this happening with people who are just generally reading literature, as I'll explain later in some of my examples. But just in general, even if we take it to this point, we think that people just aren't actually that interested in having, like, we still see that the author has to justify their perspective, whether or not that's like through the teacher explaining to the students why the author's perspective was as such. So we just don't see this having like any major benefit on their side, because instead of like having this discussion between classmates, they have this discussion with the author who has like a much more justified perspective because they themselves wrote the book, therefore it's much more accurate analysis of what the book is about for whatever reason. So moving on to my first point about how the death of the author discourages people from understanding others' perspectives. Well, first of all, we've heard this push from the affirmative team that actually it like helps them understand the other people in their classroom's perspectives. But as I asked in my POI, we think like the most important perspective in this debate is the perspective of the author, because that's why they wrote the book. Therefore, that's the perspective that these people should be trying to analyse, and they can analyse like whether or not they agree with that perspective. They don't have to analyse whether or not it's true to the book. So some mechanisms for this is, first of all, like when writing a book, authors often have a specific intention, especially if we set this debate in an English class. That's why they choose the book for the students to read. But regardless, most books have this intention anyway. So we see this in like literary devices, like symbolism, like metaphors. Like we just see this like commonly used in many books, like an Animal Farm, where the animals are used as like representations for groups of society. Because of the specific intention, which is often like a really important commentary, like socially or politically, it's really important that we actually understand this intention. E.g., like in Animal Farm, we understand that this revolt was like expressly like a metaphor about like society. If we only see this through our perspective, like then we're not just gonna like have a view on what other people thought of, especially like at the different times. Because if you only look at this book through the view of our specific political system right now in the modern world in New Zealand, you're not going to have a good understanding of like the actual meaning that the author put into this book, because they're just not living the same life as you. Therefore, you're not going to understand like the actual like thought put into this book, the meaning behind it, which has had like negative impacts overall, because you just like can actually like leach into society where you don't understand other people's opinions, because you're no longer like trying to put yourselves in the shoes of someone from that time period, from that political climate, because you only care about your perspective. So why is this bad? Well, first of all, in the MOOC, this was shown as like a widespread adoption of this theory, which means this is happening to a large extent, and to people who are just generally reading literature, which means like no one's learning properly about like the thoughts and perspectives of like why people wrote this, because it could obviously be very different depending on what time or like what place like where this book was written, which just negates it like historical and political commentary. But we can also see this in like modern books when people want like to like just read it for like a fun time. Like for example, we can use an example of Colin Hoover's book, It Ends With Us. This book was a book about domestic violence, which people took to like as like be a romantic book, which has become like the widespread notion that this book is a book about romance, which completely negates the fact that it was based off the author's experience of domestic violence, which like means that now like the book is becoming romanticized. People might be reading it and not understanding like the content they're reading and reading it at a younger age because they've been told it's a romance book because of like people interpreting it their own way. And B, this just means that people now normalize these things, which should be bad, because we know that the author wrote it to show that like domestic violence is a bad thing, but it's been so romanticized that people are like, maybe it's not as bad, maybe it's like a normal thing that just happens because of the way this book has been misinterpreted. I'll take a POI now.
Like why does accuracy to specifically the author matter?
Well, because the reason the author wrote this book was obviously for like an intended purpose. Therefore, knowing that purpose is the most important thing in this book, because like that's the perspective they were trying to push into the world. Whether or not you agree with that perspective is like the analysis you can do and see like if it's a good perspective or not. You don't have to analyze like your own view of the book, because the author already had an intention to writing that book. So moving on to my second point about like the limitations on social commentary. So I've already mentioned a bit like this, meaning like it can skew like how you understand like political or like history systems back in the day, because you just don't understand the author's perspective from where they were coming from in that day. So first of all, again, like books have this intended purpose. So by not understanding these perspectives and only taking into account your own opinion, you're never going to properly learn about these things, because we can see that people often like to learn about things like history through like fictional novels, through literature, because it's obviously just like much easier than reading like a historical article. So what we can see is that people can analyse these things by reading books about the same time period from different authors, from different perspectives. They don't need to make their own view. They can read about these different views of people at the time who obviously have a much better knowledge of this and like compare them themselves. This also just means you're more like empathetic and more understanding of things like and why people make these decisions back in the day. Like you don't have to just assume based on like the political climate now why these things happened. Like for example, if you read like The Hate U Give, you don't understand the commentary on like racial discrimination, you're never going to learn about it, because this is just like an easy way for people to learn like, oh, the author intended this to show us about racial discrimination. It's a fictional book, like it was an enjoyable read, but it's also shown me, oh, like people in these groups are actually being discriminated against, because that was the author's intention. So what does this mean? This means that if you can't
Right.
understand history, if you're putting your own twist on it, like you just don't like understand these perspectives of history, therefore you can't actually probably analyze what's like happened in the past and like how this affects you, how this affects your future. Like if someone's reading a novel that was written in 1942 in England during World War II, but you're interpreting it based off like your New Zealand like our political climate now, you're gonna have a really like vastly different understanding of the meaning of the book, which is not a good thing,
Right.
because it absolutely like can like absolutely abolish like the author's actual intention of the book and might view, like skip the perspective, like if the perspective you think would be a bad thing, you might like see it as a good perspective because of the timeline you're reading it in. So what are the outcomes of this? Well, increasing like the death of the author and like the loss of knowledge results in like a less informed society in general, because we're no longer having people gaining knowledge from like fictional literature, whether this be in English classrooms or just in general, and like understanding like the people at the time, the perspectives of the people at the time, because all they're thinking about is their personal perspective right now. So what are the impacts of this? Well, the impact of both of these points is first of all like less understanding of other perspectives and less knowledge of the social political commentary. So what does this lead to? This leads to a society where people have no like care for others' perspectives. They've grown up where they don't need to look into other people's views. They just need to know their own view, their own personal interpretation of the book. And even if we take the negating team side that they have to justify it against their classmates, they're still justifying their interpretation and still saying that their interpretation is the correct one, when in reality we know that the author wrote this book for a reason. So if anyone's interpretation is right, it's clearly the author's, because they knew what they were writing. So basically, to win this debate today, all we have to prove to you is that the death of the author system absolutely like negates the purpose of the book itself and leads to like this society where people just like don't understand perspectives, they don't know how to like analyze like the people at the time and how they felt at the time, which is just like a worse off society in general. Thank you.
I thank the speaker for their speech and invite a second
I think the point in which a book that is clearly about domestic violence is interpreted as being a love story, the problem we have here is not like we don't talk about the authors. The problem is a lack of critical thinking, right? What am I going to do in this thing? We're going to talk about the split point, especially on propaganda and like bad actors and how they can utilize one correct answer being available. Then we're going to talk about like how our side gets good analysis. That's a lot of rebuttal there. Then we're going to talk about like the value of the author's opinion and contrast that with like the value of your classmates and your own opinion. Finally, we're going to talk about how we win this debate and all of the impacting, right? Let's go straight to the split point, right? What do we have? I think that we see in history when there is a clear like answer to a question, right? To like a book. Really good example of this is when we look at something like the Bible, right? I think there is an argument to be made that there has been misinterpretation of lots of parts of the Bible. This looks like lots of the stuff relating to homosexuality. There are arguments made there, right? At the point in which there is one correct answer, what that means is it shuts out a whole conversation that could be had that leads to a bunch of negative effects, like possibly lots of negative effects towards homosexual people, right? Note that the important factor here is that there isn't a discussion about the interpretation of the Bible. There is just an interpretation of the Bible that like your priest or your pastor goes and tells you is correct. There isn't this discussion. The critical thinking is what is the most important, right? Okay. Let's then talk about like this good analysis, right? I think we heard this idea that like, yeah, you can still get lots of analysis and lots of critical thinking when there is like the author's opinion and you can engage with like, what is the author's opinion, right? We think this is totally this is true, but we think what's important and what we didn't hear engagement with was the mix we gave about how it is more entertaining when it is it's more interesting if it's coming from your perspective. There is inherently the ability to have more correct opinions, right? And so you can just have longer conversations because there's more to talk about, and it's harder to get shut down as the kid in English class who says, I think it's about this, and then your teacher's like, no, incorrect. And now you go on to hate English, right? Because you didn't feel like you were correct. For a bunch of different, those different mechanisms, we think that on our side, we get more analysis, we get more critical discourse, and that's really important. I'll take a POI now.
Yeah, you brought up the Bible as an example of a book in which having one clear answer has provided discourse and conflict, right? Would you not say that multiple different interpretations of the Bible is what's caused conflict of interest over time?
Okay, when there is the idea that there's a correct answer out there, that you can hypothetically find a correct answer, there is still critical analysis. Why? This is the same thing I'm just saying, right? There is analysis here, but we can get more analysis, right, when it is more entertaining because you can relate it to your personal experience, when it is more personalized to you, when it is harder to get shut down, and there is just probability for more conversations, right? No, we are not saying they cannot have analysis. We are saying we get more of it, and I'm going to impact why getting more of it is really, really good and really, really important, right? Let's touch on the other big push that they've had, right? They had this idea that what the author is trying to say is really important, right? I don't think we had any mechanisms at all of why this is brought it, apart from the fact that the author wanted this to happen. We think that actually, if it leads to a better world, we don't care what the author wants, right? But let's take this of what they were saying, right? Of telling a specific story does matter. Let's take this example of 1984, right? Okay. Firstly, we like to say that we think people can learn about an event, right? They can learn about the problems of the Soviet Union, right? They can learn about that from somewhere else. They can learn about that from a history book, right? Secondly, we think they can still learn about it in the engaging way they talked about, right? Of a novel, because the fact is, if you have a novel set in the USSR, right? If you have the novel Stasi Land, right? I think you probably learn about the Stasi, right? You don't need an author's interpretation to learn about the historical setting that a book is placed in. We still get that engagement, and you can still learn about those ideas from somewhere else. And then also, someone's interpretation can be the same as an author. Someone can be I think there might be an allegory here. Okay, secondly, why do these specific stories not matter, right? We think they also learn about the underlying ideas, the underlying themes of the problem of revolutionary stuff, the problems of authoritarianism that they get taught, and we think that, especially because we have better critical thinking, they can then go and apply this to other aspects of their life. We think that's really good, right? Thirdly, we prefer them to know about things that are actually relevant to them, that they can actually change, that actually happen to them, right? Because they're thinking from their own perspective. We think that's really good. Fourthly, we really prefer them to hear about their classmates and friends who are almost guaranteed to be more diverse than the literary canon that they get taught about, right? We think probably your classmates have way more important and pertinent things than just the same rehash thing of Great Gatsby, Catcher in the Rye, Scarlet Letter, right? We think there is more diversity. We think that diversity of ideas is really beneficial, really good. We prefer that over whatever one singular person in the author can offer you, right? Okay, what do we think we've set up here, right? We've set up of why we think we get better critical thinking, why this critical thinking stops dumb things that interpretation of Colleen Hoover happening, right? We then talked about why the specific stories and the author's purpose doesn't really matter, right? I think what we've left here is that we just get way better critical analysis and we stop some really bad things happening because of that critical analysis to do with misinterpretation of the Bible, right? Or other things, right? Why do we think that this critical thinking is really, really important? How do we win on this? How do we impact this, right? I think we almost got it at Thomas, but I want to say really clearly, you make a bunch of decisions every day, right? At the point in which you have to you've practiced making decisions more, you get a marginal benefit. We don't think this is revolutionary. We think there's a slight benefit of you're better able to think through things. The thing is, you make thousands of decisions every single day, right? You have millions of people making thousands of decisions every day. You have millions of people making thousands of decisions every day for thousands of days, right? We think that is the point where these marginal benefits become huge, really important benefits from the macro level of like deciding what the best government is, who should be elected next year, to like, should I like break up with my girlfriend or something. We think at that point, when you have all of these different levels throughout and everything in between, you are consistently making over like everybody is making better decisions for the world. We think this then like builds on each other and just leads to like an actually way, way better world. We think because of this, because we can prove that we get more critical thinking as opposed to like even at their best case, their case about like more specific knowledge about certain areas, we think our benefits are incredibly strong. We think we get a way better world, and we think we just like completely win this debate, right? What we have proved is that we get better critical thinking. We've taken down most of their like points. We've taken down the idea that the author's specific opinion matters, and I think at that point we clearly win the debate. Thank you very much.
Thank the speaker for their speech and invite up the second negating speaker.
The affirming side is trying to tell you that without implementing the death of the author literary analysis, there is only going to be one right answer or interpretation for a text. This is wrong, and I am going to go back to the info slide to say why. Now, it says that like the death of the author theory argues that the meaning of a text is not determined by the author's intent, but rather the reader's intention. So on their side, I'm going to prove to you today that like most of this content they've given us about like, you know, engaging with other people's worldviews, of like having better discussions, like better connections, right? It's just like flat out like not very viable, because on their side of the house, I'm going to prove to you why, because of this like death of the author's like analysis being implemented, people are going to believe that their worldviews are more important than understanding the authors or understanding others. Now, on today's point, like debate, I'm going to start with some rebuttal, and then I'm going to go on to my split point about the implications this has for like political and social knowledge and connections with other people, and this is really important, so I want you to pay attention to that when you get to it. Now, first of all, on some points they've brought up about like understanding other people's opinions, right? On this point that they've had about like more people being engaged in better analysis, they tell us that basically people are going to have like better understanding of other opinions because everyone has a different interpretation. They're able to have like debate and discussions with their other classmates. Now, first of all, like Thor has already told you about why some of these interpretations are likely to be harmful, and I will remind you of this very soon. But I first just want to bring up that like in the context of an English class, which they've brought up, right, you're more likely to have like a lot of like worldviews that are like quite in common with your classmates, right? Because of the time that you like live in, right? You grow up like with similar like political experiences like around in the world, right? Like regardless of your demographics and stuff, like you grow up in the same time, right? You grow up like in the same world with like the same kind of things going on, right? And this is really important because when you're in English class, you often like analyze historical books and stuff, which is going to go into my point. So that's why we think that like actually it's quite important to actually focus on the author's intent, because in my split point, as I'm going to get into, like historical context and understanding historical knowledge is really important to engaging with politics today and engaging with like social issues. But furthermore, like I just don't really think that they can claim that there's going to be like a better understanding of like opinions and stuff if you're not able to like on their side understand history, because you think that your own like interpretation of the text is like the right meaning of it, right? Denied. Now, also like I just want to touch on this idea that like that I've mentioned about how like these interpretations are likely to be harmful, right? Thor already gave you examples of like many literary books in which people like can interpret the book and completely negate the meaning which has been like intended to like commentate on a specific social issue. We gave you the example of like It Ends With Us, right? About how that was about a book about domestic violence, and people turned that into a book about romance, right? This is harmful because then people aren't able to like actually like understand those experiences, those harmful experiences of domestic violence, right? But I'll also give you another example of like American Psycho, a book that's like political commentary on like toxic masculinity and like competitive masculinity, all these aspects that are like, this is all social commentary, right? And when people take their own interpretations of the book, as we can see with the interpretation of American Psycho, we see that people just like completely negate this idea or ability to like learn or understand like social commentary or social criticism, right? So we see like often these interpretations end up being harmful. Like I'm going to go back to the American Psycho example, because people end up like turning this into this like toxic masculinity, sigma bro, almost like incel bordering ideology, right? And this is harmful because like it borders on like thinking your opinion is like the only one that is valued, which we see on the affirming side. Now, another thing they brought up is how like in their like better analysis and more people getting engaged point is that like in English class, like you're likely to just feel completely stupid, right? Because and like your opinion doesn't matter because the teachers are just gonna like tell you that like your interpretations are flat out wrong. Now, the reason I like recharacterized the mood a bit, like when I started this debate, is because like I'm showing you that on their side, like it literally says in the info slide and whatnot, that like your interpretations or meanings of the book become like the right interpretation to you, right? Why is this like important? Well, first of all, because like on our side of the house, we see that like we are able to have like personal interpretations of the book, right? We're able to have people like seeing their own worldviews, but we also believe that like it's really important to like look at the author's perspectives, right? Because this gives you like unique historical, political, social knowledge, which is really relevant to today, and that'll go into my next point. I'll take a POI now.
Yeah, so people misinterpret American Psycho and It Ends With Us in the status quo. You are the status quo. How do you reconcile those two things?
Okay, so actually in the status quo, the reason that people are misinterpreting these books is because they're not looking at the author's intent. I feel like that's very clear, right? Like the author's intention to write It Ends With Us was literally to like commentate on domestic violence. And when they took their own like meanings of the book, right, which is literally your model of like death of the author, they start to like ignore the simple fact of like domestic violence being the topic of the book. So it's actually like not really the status quo, and I think that's a mischaracterization. Now onto my split point on the implications for knowledge and what this means for not only historical understandings, but for people's engagement in politics and sociological understanding. And also I'm going to touch on why this is important for people's interactions, because they have already weighed highly in this debate, why like having other people's opinions valued is important. So first of all, like we already just know that like when you interpret books in your own ways, then like when you have specific interpretations that like kind of fit your own ideology, you start to like lose the knowledge that it could have given you, right? Because we've already told you that books often have like specific purposes, right? This is seen as like political commentary, social commentary, like in American Psycho, like It Ends With Us, like in George Orwell's books, right? So like some more examples for this, like there are plenty of other books that like do have specific political or like social commentary, right? We see this with like Violence 101, which is to like commentate specifically on like how the New Zealand system doesn't adhere or help like young kids in violence, right? If you're going to have your own interpretations of this, like you lose that ability to actually like gain more knowledge and gain more understanding of like other topics, which I think is really important for understanding other perspectives, right? Because not only are these books just like written in different time periods where different things were going on and you didn't experience them, so innately by like understanding the author's perspectives, you gain understanding of like different perspectives across time. But overall, you're just engaging more with like different perspectives because you're still able on our side to have like your own interpretations. Like on both sides, you're still able to have like political discussions, but at least you're not like completely ignoring the historical context in which these books are written, like on the F side. Now, like, this is a really important, right? And I really want you to, like, really weigh highly, like, authors in today's debate, right? Because authors are really important because they're the ones writing these books. And as we told you, like, time and time again, like, throughout today's debate, like, these authors have specific intentions for these books. These authors, like, provide knowledge in these books that are really important for the people who are reading them. Really important in English class, right? Because in English class, you're literally analyzing these books to gain knowledge out of them. We've already told you that, like, like these authors like have specific intentions, and through this like we've shown you that they are able to like you are able to understand other people's experiences, not only just in your current time through like discourse, through like political understanding, but you're able to like understand other people's experiences throughout time, which is something that they just can't really claim on their side by saying that you're not understanding like the author's perspective and that you're only engaging with perspectives that are only your own or others. I also think this is really important too, because like the affirming side claim that like on their side, they're just gonna like take these historical books and apply them to yourself, right? You're gonna take these like books of people's experiences and just rephrase it to your own life, which I think is just kind of like a bad way, like a bad thing to claim if they want to prove that you're gonna have like better understanding of other people and like have a better breach of like cultural understanding and understanding people's issues. So at the end of today's debate, we just have better political discourse, better political understanding, social understanding, and overall we win on that fact. Thank you.
Thank the speaker for their speech and invite up third F.
I have two major qualms with the neg case. I think first, it relies far too heavily on the idea that the author's opinion just like inherently has value, which I don't think has been very sufficiently met. And then secondarily, I think it refuses to engage with the fact that to get any value from the author's perspective being shared, people actually have to be interested enough in English to listen to the teacher and think about what these books are. I think we're going to explain that, look, we think the author holds no value compared to the experiences we're sharing, but actually, even if the author is like marginally better for us to hear from because for some reason they're super smart, it's probably better for us to be understanding and engaging with opinions which are more pertinent to our everyday lives and are actually going to result in us making better decisions for things which we actually do, rather than like Animal Farm for people in the US today, which we probably don't think is very relevant. I've got 3 points of clash. First of all, does the author's opinion hold any value? Secondarily, current issues and points of views, and then propaganda. I would like to note the third one, I hesitate to call a point of clash because we haven't heard a single response, and we think it's really important because actually, even if one less person is in an authoritarian regime in the world, that's probably good compared to, like Thomas flagged at first, relatively small-scale benefits in the Western world. Okay. I'm going to start with this first point of clash. Does the author provide any value? Now again, before I get into this, I'd like to flag the fact that their entire case hinges upon this, right? If the author has no unique value to the reader, then there is nothing they can do to win this debate, whereas our case does not. Even if the author has more value, we can show that we're getting more people interested in these, and whatever we are getting people, whatever value there is rather, is more likely to be gleaned by the people in the process. Because once again, let's take this back to the classroom, right? We are talking about students who realistically don't really want to be there, so it's incredibly important that they are having something to try and help them engage. But okay, let's get into the material. They've basically told us from first that it kind of has value because it does, and then they started to make it second, though I'd like to say that I think I'm going to be making a lot of this kind of on their behalf and then responding to it. I don't think it was very well elaborated on, that the author has some unique knowledge or value. There are two possible reasons I think this could be. Like, maybe they're just super smart, right? Maybe the reason you become an author is because you have some unique knowledge which nobody else understands. You know, every interaction you had with people when they were your age, they just didn't want to talk about the socio and economic state of the world right now, and so you go and become an author. Or maybe old things are particularly important, right? Like maybe thinking about what happened in the 50s and 60s is particularly important for the modern day world, and so we need to learn about these. Two responses to each of those things. First of all, I think the literary canon probably adapts a lot more slowly than the problems in the everyday world, right? Like, we still haven't really had books be written about mis and disinformation and fictional books about that, and then it'll probably take another 10 years for someone to realize they were actually good books, and then another 50 years for those to become integrated into what we actually teach in classrooms. So what we actually teach in classrooms is not going to be relevant to the issues we're facing in the everyday world today, which we think means that the author can't have any more relevance than today's texts, which probably aren't going to be analysed on either side of the house because the literary canon adapts very slowly. The alternative, when we take it back to the classroom, is that we spend more time discussing what other people in our classroom think and feel, which is probably much more relevant because they also live in our everyday world. Second response, we think it's extremely far removed from your everyday life, which makes it difficult for you to implement it, right? Now again, there are probably 3 debaters who are going to go on to be politicians in this English class. There are also 20 other kids who maybe won't even vote, right? So learning about Animal Farm and what happened in the Soviet Union maybe won't impact them as severely or won't influence their everyday life and actions in as positive a manner as learning what it's like to be an African American child growing up by listening to what your African American classmate says about this text and what they saw in it. We think that's probably a lot more relevant and provides a lot more value than the author because of those reasons I've just given you. Secondarily, their most fleshed out response, which is the idea that we need to learn their story, they've got a story, they set out to write it, therefore we need to learn it. Their chief example of this has been domestic violence. We have 2 responses to this. First of all, realistically, we think that if it can be misinterpreted from domestic violence to romance, it can probably be misinterpreted in the reverse in a bunch of other ways, like romance to domestic violence, or probably a better example, like Top Gun to No, It's a Gay Love Story about Maverick and Goose, right? Those kinds of things are probably just as likely to be misinterpreted. And actually, they've given no functional reason why it's more important that we listen to the author's interpretation than a misinterpreted version of someone else's interpretation if both of them lead to the same thing. And so we can probably respond quite sufficiently to that. And then secondarily, we just think that, once again, this point of clash doesn't matter so much because more relevant is better and also just more happening is better, right? I'm going to explain in this next point of clash why we're having more of this happen. So 2 things for you to believe or not believe. Either you believe that it is more relevant and therefore better, in which case we win this point of clash, but even if we lose it and you think the author does have some value because they can use the mechs I spoon-fed them, then that's probably not as important when you put it up against people actually learning to engage. Because once again, we framed this in the English classroom. You have to convince people to be engaged. So that's probably more important. So we actually don't need to win this point of clash, but again, they do. So I'll move on to my next point of clash, but it's POI.
Yeah, so would you not say that a book that's commentary on maybe political authoritarianism, like 1984, has some relevance in today's society where we see the rise of authoritarianism in society?
Look, it probably does, but once again, we think that other people can provide these perspectives, right? Someone else in your classroom could probably provide the perspective of what it's like to live in a society where nobody likes you and it seems like you have no freedom, right? So someone, for example, let's say, a woman could probably provide the perspective of what it feels like to live in a society where you don't have bodily autonomy. That's functionally similar to living in a society where you don't have free speech. We think other people can provide those perspectives in the same way, and they're probably going to be more keenly listened to because of the stuff I'm about to get into. Okay, current issues and POVs. We think this is super, super important, right? This is probably the most important point in the debate, because if you understand everybody else around you, then you're interacting with them more often. And if you're interacting with everyone you interact with frequently better, then we have lots of these compounding benefits that Thomas articulated so eloquently. So, we have 3 main things here. First of all, we think the classroom is more diverse than the canon, right? We think that most people just read the same 5 books written by an old white guy. You're probably not going to get the same diverse perspectives compared to, even if you've grown up in the same area, people who come from different socioeconomic backgrounds, different races, different cultural backgrounds. All of those things mean that we get more diverse perspectives being heard on our side of the house, and so you're listening and hearing about more things. Because once again, this looks like the classroom where one person shares what they thought about the text and why, another person shares what they thought about the text and why. Smash those 2 together, you have diverse perspectives. We think that's really important. And again, you interact with them very often, so it's great. Gay classmates, Top Gun example. Okay, next, we think it's more pertinent, because these are more likely to be the things which you actually take action on, right? Modern political issues, like what it's like to be a black person in America, is probably more important to your life than even if it could be abstractly related, something that goes on in 1984. And finally, we think because you don't feel stupid, and because these things are relevant to your everyday life, and because they're relevant to your classmates' lives, and you're probably better friends with your classmates, all of those 3 things form this sort of self-fulfilling cycle where you end up more interested, and so you do more discussion, and then you end up even more interested, do even more discussion. Now we've just got a lot more people, even if it's being a little bit more engaged, being engaged in critical thinking and seeing what other people think. That's a huge benefit. Those haven't really been responded to. The only response they've had here is your thing you believe that your thing's true. I don't think this engage with our mech of what it actually looks like in the classroom, of you sharing your opinion, someone else sharing your opinion, and that's only possible on our side of the house when you don't believe that there is one correct answer, right? When you fundamentally believe that there's a question mark of what the truth is, you get that discussion. That's not a benefit they can claim. Extremely important point of clash, like I've just explained. Finally, propaganda. Look, I'll just whip the material because it has not been responded to. Look, when there's only one answer, it can be hijacked by bad actors. This looks like, people using religious texts to change what they think it means. That's really important because if there's one more person who's aware of what's going on in a bad regime, they can action that. We think that's important, but because they haven't responded to it, doesn't need that much time. Thank you very much. We win all 3 points of clash, win the debate.
Thank you to the speaker. I invite third Ned up.
I think the first thing that's important to point out in this debate is how much the affirmative team has just negated the wider implications of literature in our society, right? They stuffed this entire debate into some English classroom, which somehow seems to be the most diverse place in the world, which we'll get into, it's not, and just seem to forget how important literature and historical literature and kind of the opinions of a diverse range of people throughout society can have on analysts, historians, sociologists, and just the inherent value you can get from hearing people's worldviews. The first thing I'm going to do today is just to sort of cover off their stuff about the English classroom. I'm going to go over the symmetry on analysis, on how we get just as much analysis on our side, and we're going to get people that continue to think to just as much of a high level as other people. I'm then going to go through our 3 main points of clash, which is the creation of discussion, the value of the author, and the understanding of the world we can get out of it. Right, to begin with, we'll go over the symmetry on this point of analysis, right? We see that the affirming team has this big push that when you kind of analyze books within your English classroom, it means that you're going to have more opinions, right? You have 10, 20 people giving you opinions. This is inherently better than just one person giving you this opinion. We tell you this is not true, right? Your English classroom isn't that diverse. You see that people living in the same time, often from very similar cultures, very similar ethnicities, right? To a very large extent, we see that these people will form similar opinions about the world they live in, right? We see that in this way, the author is inherently better, right? They potentially come from somewhere else. Not every book is written by an old white man, right? We have authors from all around the world, every ethnicity, every gender, race, culture. This means that the information we can get out when we compile all these authors together in a wide range is just so much more valuable than that of some high school English students. But what we do tell you is that even when we reject this idea that we must always make our own interpretation of what the books are, we can have this understanding, and we can look into the motivations and the understanding of the author, right? This is just as engaging for analysis. Why did someone think this way? What did they experience? What did they go through so that this was their worldview, right? This promotes just as much analysis, right? So on this point, we kind of have this symmetry. But what I'll add here is that we also get a more empathetic worldview. We see the worldview of a much more diverse range of people when you take into the fact that not every book is written by an old white man, right? And in the English classrooms of today, there's a way bigger impacting on having books that aren't written there. The Hate You Give, a very kind of recent book about racial injustice in America, right? That is something that's incredibly important, right? And the white boys in your English class just won't have the same level of analysis and the same level of understanding of what's going in there as the author. Yes?
Yeah, I hate reading and hate English. I finally find a book that I enjoy and feel seen in when I come to school on Monday and share my perspective and am told that it is incorrect because it is not what the author intended. How am I going to feel for the rest of my life towards English and analysis and discussion?
I think any person that's putting that much analysis into this one given book is probably going to find some other inherent value in English, right? And we do still argue that in a lot of these books, it's not hard to find books that align with your worldview. If you really just want to see things that do appeal to you, you can do that. But we're saying that it's like incredibly minimizing on like the entire field of like media and literature to like believe that every person should like do this thing. And again, we're going to come back to this idea that this debate does not just happen in the English classroom, right? There's like a wide variety of people who like are sort of much more important even in like the things that they can get out of these books. I'm getting into my points of clash now, which is the creation of discussion, which we have sort of just been over, the value of the author and the understanding of the world. Sort of on the creation of discussion, you know, we've kind of told you it's very similar, like in an English classroom setting. But what we do get on our side is we get like this deeper discussion outside of it, right? The people that aren't in an English classroom, right? Like sociologists, like historians, these people are able to look at the opinions of other people. They're able to look at like the lives other people have led, and they are able to like glean information, right? Of course, not interpreting the book, but like looking at the influences that caused them to write it. Like why did somebody kind of like have the opinions they did? Why did George Orwell feel the way he did about, you know, communism as we see in like Animal Farm and sort of systems like that? Secondly then, on the value of the author, right? We hear like this really big push from the affirming team that like the author has no value. They cannot contribute anything. I mean, this is so incredibly untrue. Like it's not even funny. Authors like provide an analysis of the time they live in, right? They're obviously someone who kind of like has an understanding of the life they've lived and the experiences that they've had, right? The affirming team sort of gives you this push that like an author has to be some incredibly educated person who like has this most incredible worldview to write a book about the things that like they experience. This simply is not true, right? We can like see plenty of people are able to write books. Like if we take this example again of like The Hate You Give, right? Written by like a young black woman in America, right? This is somebody who obviously is just writing about the experiences they've had. That is something that's incredibly valuable to have like a better understanding of the world. Secondly, then we can see that like within historical texts and things like that, there is like an incredible value we can get out and like seeing the motivations of the people that have written it. Like this has been like asserted by my speakers, right? We see that it's an incredibly valuable tool for like these historians, for people to like look at these books. They're able to look at the reasons they're written, and they're able to glean like a better understanding of like what was going on and like the sort of the political and like social climate of the world at that time and how that can like, you know, influence and how that influences the time, right? This already is like a huge impact we can get out of this, right? We hear kind of this like thing from the affirming team that like none of the impacts here are going to be very big. We say that this is very big, right? Like this is something, it allows us to have like a better understanding of the world around us. It allows us to look back and reflect on the world we live in and the world that we have lived in, and we can see that, you know, inherently it has like just huge consequences, and we can see this kind of in the sense that when we have a better understanding of the world around us. Yes, I'll take that.
Yeah, so for Caroline from Corpus Christi, do you think it's more important that she has a nuanced understanding of Orwell or even a passing understanding of what it's like for the black people around her to live every day?
I'm not quite sure I understand your question. I'm going to go on to our sort of, I'll finish off talking about our second point of clash, which is on the value of the author, right? We say, you know, even if you don't buy this fact that like authors like don't have to be, authors have like this, the intention of the author in itself has value, right? Like as we have told you, it does not have to be like some like huge kind of nuanced understanding of anything in particular, right? And for that reason, like these authors in themselves are valuable in the experiences that they can push. I just want to really quickly point out like a couple comments that the affirming team has made about like misunderstanding is happening about things right now, like American Psycho. It's like misread as some like Sigma story about how like yuppie Americans are really cool, and they tell us that like that's happening right now and that we stand for the status quo. This like simply is not true. This like perfectly like underlines our case, right? We already see that like the death of author like theory exists at this time, and we can see the damages like as they have admitted through examples like American Psycho, right? And we see the damages they do, and we just stand for like stopping it now and kind of minimizing this. We do not want this to take over like what literature can mean. Like as we tell you, it can have like huge impacts on the world around us, and we still get the same amount of analysis like in the classroom that they like to put. That means that like our policies and like our political understandings will be just the same, but we have like way greater value like in historians and in like the wider people of society. Thank you.
Thank the speaker for the speech. Reverse the speaking order, so I invite the neg reply up.
this debate has really come down to two main factors. First of all, which side creates better critical thinking skills for the future, and second of all, the actual value of the author for people today. First of all, about critical thinking. So the affirmative team have given us this big push that if you only look at your opinion, this creates discussion within an English classroom, and because you have a very diverse classroom where you can share your opinions with your classmates. Well, we told you first of all that not necessarily everyone's going to discuss their opinions because literary analysis is not set only in English classrooms. But even if we take that it's only in a classroom setting, they really overestimated the impact of high school English. So only a marginal amount of students would even participate in this, which just means that at their best case, they have a couple of students sharing their opinions with their classmates, which, as we have mixed out for you, will generally be of a similar status as you, and not as diverse as the affirmative team is trying to claim they're going to be. So you're still going to be talking to people your own age from the same area as you, having this generally a similar opinion, and it just doesn't create as much critical thinking skills as you would have on our side of the house, where you have the opinion of the author who lived in a vastly different time, in a vastly different society that you lived in. Even if it's just the fact that they lived in a different country, that's still an entirely different situation. And we see that them analysing these authors, them understanding their perspectives, why they had that perspective, whether or not they think this perspective is right or wrong, is going to give them a much more unique perspective and an understanding of things and much better critical thinking skills. So what are the impacts of this that we've seen so far? Well, at the best on the affirmative team, they have a couple of English class students sharing their opinions. Even if we take that this English class is incredibly diverse and has people from all over the world, from all different races and socioeconomic groups, they're still just all the same age. They still might not be as engaged in the material. They still don't have the actual intention from the author, and we just still think overall that hasn't got as good critical thinking skills as we've told you at third. And we see that people have the same analysis on our side at the least. We still have a symmetrical amount of analysis just about the author instead of about their classmates. But what we see is it's more likely on our side that the authors are much more unique perspective than your classmates, which means we're more likely to have a better impact. But at the very least, we would have the same impact. Therefore, we win this point. Second of all, they've rested their whole case on everyone living in this engaging English class, which is why our point on how important the author is actually really still stands. So we've told you multiple times that the value of the author is really incredibly important, because that's they wrote this book for a reason. So whether or not you agree with this perspective, as we've said, it's still important for you to understand that perspective, and it's more likely to be a different perspective from the people around you, whether or not you even share that information. And continuing to only have your own opinion is just going to give you in the society where your opinion is the best one and the right one, and it's going to perpetuate this cycle. I brought this up at first. The only thing we heard back from the affirming team about this is that this isn't true, because actually they're in an English classroom where they'll share their opinions, so they'll learn other people's opinions. As we've mentioned before, this is simply a not true framing of this debate. But even if we agree that for some reason they're all in an English classroom, not as we've mentioned multiple times, they're not necessarily going to share their opinions, and they don't a super diverse classroom. So what we see from this is that we've proven to you that people even within only a classroom setting still get a better impact on our side of the house, because they're sharing with their they're understanding their critical thinking skills through someone who has a vastly different perspective to them, to understanding different political and historical settings. And we've shown you at first how this impacts them in the future, how this gives them a better understanding of society, of history, how this gives them better political views, and just overall this is a better outcome for everyone. But even at least we have these people understanding different perspectives way more on our side of the house than on the affirmative side of the house. We've also shown you how the value of the author is actually important, and the affirmative team were trying to say it doesn't matter because they're all these old white men who have nuanced ideas. We've proven to you, especially at third, that this is simply not true, that people of colour, people of different genders all write books, and that's why these books are more important to read than the opinions of your classmates. Thank you.
I thank the speaker and invite up the affirmative reply.
I think this has been a messy debate because we've had a lack of interaction from both sides, and we've also had some big assertions that a lot of the points rely on, right? How do I still think we win this debate? It's basically, in summary, it comes down to teaching a man how to fish instead of giving him a fish or two fish. Okay, 3 points of clash: critical thinking, then our two fishes about misinterpretation and specific knowledge, right? Okay, let's talk about critical thinking. I think this is the first example of where there hasn't been enough interaction, because I think we heard two really good ideas of there is the ability to have lots of ideas and thoughts. We gave 4 different mechanisms of how we think having multiple possible answers, having answers that are more likely and more tailored to who you are as a person, is more likely to engender more conversation. We did hear a response from the other side that you can still get this analysis, and there is still plenty of analysis to be had at the author level. At no point, and we said this down the line, did we disagree with this, but both teams just went past each other at this point. What still stands is those last mix of why it's still exciting, why it's still just easier to have conversation about 6 different opinions as opposed to 1. What that means is we get, and also the teacher shutting you down. Those 3 things are really, really important in this space. I actually think they're debate winning, because at the point when you accept that those happen, you accept that there is a slight margin where people are more interested in English, they do more of English, they learn these more critical skills. We gave you really, really strong weighing that I don't think we've had any response to, of how having slightly better critical thinking skills, when you put that on a planetary scale, when you put that on a decades scale, when you put that on the millions of decisions people make, it becomes a huge benefit. That is just debate winning. We win at that point. Okay. What have the big harms we've heard from the other side been? We've basically, first thing is this idea of misinterpretation. I think why this point is really sticky is because both teams have just asserted on our side that only learning happens in the classroom, on their side that it happens in other places too. No team has given each other a mechanism. Both teams have asserted that down the line, right? I think the fact is, on their side, they still accept that there are some things that happen in the classroom, and I think that gives us a benefit of misinterpretation. I again think we also outweigh all of those points about bad misinterpretation with the really good stuff on critical thinking. We also outweigh it on the fact of propaganda and the bad misinterpretation that can exist on their side too. We think we outweigh it with both of those. We think at that point this is at worst for them really good for us, and at best it's just even, right? Okay. Then, this idea of specific knowledge, right? Again, we weigh teaching people how to make better decisions better than just having a little bit more specific knowledge, right? Okay, again, we just said they can have it elsewhere. They were yeah, here's a bunch of reasons why it's really important to get it from there. I don't think we've had enough interaction with our multiple mix of where you can get it elsewhere and why we value other things. We've heard responses to ideas of diversity, right? But their only response was at third neg where we can't respond to it, and they still didn't interact with our mechanisms of why the canon can't catch up. They may have had examples, right, of how the canon has books that have caught up to current state. I think we probably would have just rejected that those books were there and said we actually have the mechanisms to prove why they would be there. They purely have examples. Let's step back. What do we have? We have a point where we've got a lack of interaction, which probably still leans towards us, but we can just put that aside. We've got a point of misinterpretation where there's been just pure assertions. Again, we think we outweigh it because of our propaganda points, but again, we can put that to the side because the fundamental, most important thing that matters is we get slightly better critical thinking skills. You times that again and again and again, and you get a significantly better world. We win this debate.
Thank you all for a lovely debate. I'd like to cross over, shake hands, and then if everyone can leave the room. Thank you.